The mountain man was used to whispers. Folks in the valley had always called him wild, a brute who belonged in the pines with the wolves and the snow. But when his brother died and left behind a young widow, the whispers turned crueler. They said he lingered too long near her cabin. They said his eyes softened when she came down to the river. They said no good would come of him watching over a woman who wasn't his to claim. He didn't answer them. Words were wind. His silence only fed their laughter. She, too, heard the mockery. Her husband barely cold in the ground, and already the town tore her name to shreds. Every trip for supplies was a gauntlet of smirks and side glances. But she knew the truth. The mountain man had kept her safe through winter storms, chopped her wood when her hands blistered, and stood guard when wolves prowled close. He had been her shield when grief hollowed her out. Still, she feared what people thought, until the night he confessed in quiet, broken words that he'd rather live with her hatred than with the lie of silence. It was no sudden courtship, no easy path. Nights in the cabin burned with guilt and longing both, their hearts torn between duty to the dead and the fierce pull of the living. Yet the fire between them would not be denied. What began as comfort became something deeper, older than blood and stronger than shame. And when spring came, so did the secret no gossip could deny, the swell of her belly beneath her apron, the proof of life that carried his eyes in her strength. The laughter in the valley stopped then, curdled into silence. Men who once mocked him lowered their gaze when he rode into town for salt and flour. Women who once whispered behind their hands found no words when the widow's glow showed she was no longer mourning but living again. Their love, condemned by rumor, now carried the weight of undeniable truth. What they had built in the shadows of mountains now stood in daylight, unashamed. The mountain man said little, as ever. But when he laid his rough palm against the swell of her stomach, his eyes softened in a way that silenced the whole valley louder than any gunshot. She was his, he was hers, and together they had turned grief into a future that no mockery could erase. Summer brought no peace, only new battles. The gossip that once mocked them now turned sharper, angrier. A few men in town, jealous of the mountain man's strength and the widow's newfound glow, began to mutter that he had stolen his brother's wife and dishonored the family name. It wasn't just talk anymore. One evening, he found his cabin door marked with a carved cross, a warning that their union was cursed. The widow trembled when she saw it, but he only took his knife, cut the wood clean, and burned the splinters in the fire. They'll not decide what's cursed, he told her. This house belongs to us, not them. The valley's preacher tried to intervene next, paying her a visit while the mountain man was away hunting. He spoke of sin, of vows unbroken even in death, of scandal that would stain her child. His words pressed heavy on her heart, for she had been raised to obey scripture and honor the dead. But when her hand strayed to her belly, feeling the faintest stir of life, her resolve hardened. Judge me if you must, she said softly, but this child is no curse. He's hope, and hope don't come from the devil. When the mountain man returned, she told him everything, the carved mark, the preacher's warning, the doubts clawing at her in the dark of night. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he drew her close, his hand steady on the small of her back. Let them call me what they will, he rumbled. Beast, thief, sinner, I've been named worse. But they'll not take you. They'll not take our child. I'll see to that. There was a fire in his eyes that promised blood if anyone dared try. The weeks that followed proved him true. When two men cornered her at the trading post, spitting words about shame and sin, the mountain man arrived before they could lay a hand on her. His fist dropped one in the dirt, the other scrambling for cover. After that, no man dared touch her, though their eyes still burned with judgment. The widow's fear began to ease. For every threat, his presence stood taller, his silence louder than their jeers. Slowly, the valley folk realized he could not be broken, and she would not bend. By autumn, when her belly grew full and round, even the cruelest tongues fell quiet. The sight of her, radiant and unashamed beside him at the harvest fair, silenced years of mockery. Whispers turned to stares, stares to uneasy respect. They had tried to shame them into silence, but the mountain man and his sister-in-law had built something stronger than gossip, a life forged in hardship, bound in love, and proven in the promise of the child she carried. The valley, at last, began to understand, mockery had no power against truth. Winter came hard to the valley, snow falling thick across the pines, sealing the cabins in white silence. For the widow, the days grew longer, the nights heavier, as the child pressed against her ribs and slowed her steps. Yet never once did she feel abandoned. The mountain man split wood until his hands bled, kept the fires roaring, and walked miles through drifts to bring her broth and herbs from town. When the labor pains began one bitter night, he stayed at her side, rough hands trembling as he guided her through every breath. He was no midwife, no healer, only a man clumsy with tenderness, but his presence was her anchor. The hours stretched, and the storm outside screamed like wolves. By lantern light, she clung to him, crying out her pain, while he whispered words he never thought he knew. When the child's cry finally split the silence, it felt as though the mountains themselves bowed their heads. He cradled the tiny bundle with awe, his hardened face breaking into something soft, almost boyish. "Our son," he breathed, as though the words alone could warm the cold night. She, exhausted, smiled weakly. "Our hope," she whispered back. News of the child spread quickly come morning. The same neighbors who once spat at their union now stood hushed at the cabin door, bringing broth, cloth, and even awkward congratulations. The mountain man accepted nothing with open hands, but his silence softened as he saw how their sneers had turned to quiet respect. They hadn't just proven their love, they'd forced the valley to see it. No rumor, no scripture, no carved curse could argue with the living truth of a child. For the widow, the shame that had once weighed on her was gone. She no longer carried grief for what she'd lost, but pride for what she had built. Watching her son in his father's arms, she knew they had carved a place of their own in the mountains, far stronger than the town's judgment. The whispers that had haunted her were gone, replaced with a quiet dignity that no one could strip away. As for the mountain man, he needed no words. Each time he looked at his son, each time his eyes met hers across the fire, the truth was plain. He had been mocked, cursed, even hated, but in the end, he had won something greater than respect. He had a family, a home, and a love that no storm could shake. The mountains, once so lonely, now echoed with laughter that was theirs. Spring thaw brought danger with it. As the passes opened, outlaws drifted into the valley, rough men with nothing to lose. Among them was a cousin of the mountain man's late brother, a bitter soul who claimed the widow and child as his rightful inheritance. He stirred old whispers, saying no true union had ever been made, that the mountain man was nothing but a thief who'd stolen both land and blood. The valley folk, though uneasy, listened in silence. Their respect was fragile, and he meant to break it. The cousin came to their cabin one morning, armed and arrogant, demanding the widow leave with him and the child. She stood tall in the doorway, the babe on her hip, her voice like steel. "This is my home, my child's home. We're not yours to claim." But when the man's hand went to his gun, the mountain man stepped from the trees, axe resting heavy on his shoulder, eyes colder than the snowmelt river. "You'll not take a thing from us," he growled, every word a promise. What followed was no quick draw in the street, but a brutal struggle in the mud. The cousin swung wild, drunk on hate, but the mountain man fought with the strength of a life lived hard. Steel rang, fists cracked, blood splattered the thawing ground. In the end, the cousin lay broken, the mountain man's shadow cast over him like the weight of the mountains themselves. He spared his life but not his pride, hauling him to the valley's edge and leaving him there with words the whole town repeated, "Come back, and you'll not walk away again." The fight sealed what the child's birth had begun. No longer could anyone deny their bond, nor claim it was shame or sin. The widow had chosen, the mountain man had defended, and the valley had witnessed it all. Where once there had been whispers, now there was only a wary respect, even admiration. Together they had faced gossip, scripture, and blood, and together they had prevailed. That night, as the babe slept between them, she laid her hand over his and whispered, "No more running. No more hiding." He kissed her knuckles, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "Never again," he vowed. And in that vow was the end of mockery, the end of doubt, and the beginning of a life forged not just by love, but by the fire of trial and the strength of two hearts that refused to break. Years passed, and the valley slowly forgot the sharp edges of its gossip. The cabin that once stood alone among pines grew into a homestead with smoke curling from its chimney, fields carved into the earth, and laughter echoing across the meadows. The widow, no longer called such, was known simply as the mountain man's wife, a title earned not by ceremony but by the life they had lived, side by side. Her hair carried silver now, but her eyes still held that same fierce spark that had once defied the whole town. Their son grew tall and strong, the very image of his father in broad shoulders and steady gaze, though his mother's gentleness softened him. He was raised not with shame, but with pride, taught that family was built not by bloodlines alone, but by love and loyalty. By the time he was grown, the valley no longer questioned his place. He was proof that strength and kindness could come from what others once mocked. Neighbors who had once turned their backs now came seeking advice, or help with winter stores, or safety when wolves prowled the edges of their farms. The mountain man never sought to lead, but folks looked to him all the same. His silence, his work, and his unyielding love had carved a respect stronger than any preacher's sermon or lawman's badge. The very people who had scorned him now told their children stories of the man who had defended his family against all odds. On quiet evenings, when the sun sank low and painted the peaks in fire, he would sit with his wife on the porch, her hand tucked into his. They spoke little. Words had never been his gift, but their silence was full, comfortable, a language all its own. Sometimes she sang, soft as wind in the pines, and he would close his eyes, remembering the years of struggle that had led them here. And when strangers passed through the valley, hearing the tale of the wild mountain man and the widow he had loved against all judgment, they always looked at the homestead with wonder. For it stood not just as wood and stone, but as proof that love, once mocked and cursed, could outlast even the mountains. Their story became part of the land itself, whispered not as scandal but as legend. The boy grew into a man beneath the shadow of the peaks, his life shaped by hard winters and long summers in the saddle. Folks in the valley called him Daniel, though most simply said, the Dawson boy, when he passed, as if his parents' story still lingered on his shoulders. He carried it well, broad, steady, quiet like his father, but with his mother's sharp wit glinting in his eyes. And though he had no shame in his bloodline, he longed to carve a name of his own, not live forever as the proof of their defiance. When Daniel turned 20, he began making trips downriver, hauling timber and hides to the markets where strangers didn't know his story. In those bustling towns, he found freedom, and it was there he first laid eyes on Clara, a merchant's daughter with laughter that cut through the din of the trading post like a bell. She was bold, curious, unafraid to ask questions most folk wouldn't dare. To Daniel, she was like the first thaw after winter, bright, irresistible, and dangerous in ways he couldn't yet name. But Clara belonged to another world. Her father spoke of railroads, banks, and fine carriages, the very things Daniel's family had resisted all their lives. The valley folk muttered when word spread of his interest, warning that a union between mountain and town would never last. Your pa carved a life from defiance, one old neighbor said. Don't throw it away chasing a girl who don't know a rifle from a plow. But Daniel only smiled. He had inherited his father's stubbornness, and his mother's fire. It wasn't long before trouble brewed. Clara's father, proud and ambitious, declared no daughter of his would wed a man from the mountains, especially not the son of a scandal. He mocked Daniel's bloodline, saying no respectable name could be built on sin. The words cut, sharp as a knife, but Daniel did not flinch. He had heard worse all his life, and he had seen with his own eyes how mockery turned to silence when faced with unyielding love. One evening, standing on the ridge where his parents had built their home, Daniel asked his father what to do. The mountain man, older now but still unbroken, laid a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. They mocked me too, boy. Mocked your ma, but we didn't fight for their approval, we fought for each other. If she's worth the fight, then fight. If she ain't, let her go. Daniel nodded, staring into the valley below, where smoke from the town curled into the horizon. For the first time, he knew his story was only beginning. Daniel wasted no time. The next market day, he walked straight into the merchant's hall, boots muddy from the trail, hat in hand. Every eye turned, the air thick with judgment, but he didn't blink. Clara's father sat behind his polished desk, smug as a banker counting coins. I've come to speak plain, Daniel said. I aim to marry your daughter. The room erupted in laughter, merchants, clerks, even hired guns. But Daniel's voice cut through, low and steady. Mock all you like. I've seen men laugh before. Didn't stop my pa from carving a life here. Won't stop me, neither. Clara's father leaned forward, his smile sharp as a knife. Boy, you think your pa fists and your ma's shame make you a man worth my daughter. You've got land, sure, but no name, no wealth, no standing. I won't see her tied to a mountain savage. His words hung in the air, cruel and deliberate. Clara flinched, her cheeks burning, but Daniel's jaw tightened like stone. He didn't lash out, didn't snarl, he simply tipped his hat and said, respect won't be asked. It'll be earned. Then he turned and walked out, leaving silence in his wake. That night, Clara rode out of town under the cover of dark, her skirts muddied, her hair tangled by the wind. She found Daniel by the river, where he had gone to cool his temper. I don't care about his name, his money, or his standing, she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. I care about you. Daniel pulled her into his arms, his heart hammering. But he knew what her leaving meant. The merchant wouldn't let this go quietly. Trouble was coming. Sure enough, the next week, hired riders came up the valley road, 5 of them, armed and ready. Their orders were clear. Drag Clara back, make an example of Daniel, and break whatever spirit the Dawsons thought they carried. The valley folk watched from their porches, unsure whether to intervene or to let the fight prove itself. The mountain man, old but unbowed, stood with his son, rifle across his chest. This is your stand, Daniel, he said. Same as mine once was. Show 'em who you are. The standoff came at sunset, the riders sneering as they closed in, Clara clutching Daniel's hand. The air was thick with dust, the smell of iron and pine. Daniel stepped forward, his father's rifle in one hand, his mother's resolve burning in his heart. He knew then that the fight wasn't about gossip, wealth, or even Clara's hand, it was about proving, once and for all, that a name forged in love could outlast any curse, any mockery, any power the valley tried to wield against it. The riders spread out, their horses snorting, iron glinting in the fading sun. One spat into the dirt. Hand the girl over, boy, and maybe we'll leave you breathing. Daniel said nothing. He shifted the rifle in his grip, calm as a winter creek, and planted his boots firm in the mud. Behind him, his father stood silent, watching, not to fight his son's battle, but to see if the boy would stand like a man. The first rider nudged his horse forward, grinning wide, pistol loose at his hip. Daniel's voice cut through the dusk, low and steady, turn back. You ride one step closer, you won't ride back at all. The man laughed, a harsh bark, and flicked his reins. That's when Daniel fired. The crack split the valley, the rider's hat flew off, and his horse reared, throwing him into the dirt. The shot hadn't killed him, but it had made the point clear as thunder. The others shifted, muttering, their bravado shaken. One drew his pistol, but before he could level it, the mountain man's rifle cocked loud in the silence. His father spoke then, his voice gravel and iron, my boy warned you once. I won't warn you twice. The riders hesitated, glancing at each other. They had come for an easy scare, not a war with men who didn't flinch. Clara stepped forward then, her chin high, fire in her eyes. Tell my father this, she said, her voice ringing across the standoff. I chose him. I chose this life. And no man, not you, not him, will drag me back. The riders blinked, thrown off balance by her defiance. One cursed, yanked his horse around, and the others followed, their retreat loud and angry but certain. Dust swallowed them as they fled back toward town. When the silence returned, Daniel lowered the rifle, his hands steady, his breath calm. The mountain man's eyes softened with pride, and for the first time in his life, he laid a hand on his son's shoulder not as a teacher, but as an equal. You stood, he said simply. Clara squeezed his hand, her smile trembling but sure. In that moment, the valley knew, the boy mocked as the son of scandal had become a man whose name would carry farther than the mountains themselves. Word of the failed ambush spread faster than wildfire. By the time Daniel and Clara rode into town the next morning, every porch and shopfront was crowded with watchful eyes. Some whispered, some nodded in quiet respect, but none dared jeer. The riders had returned broken and humiliated, and everyone knew who had sent them running. Clara sat tall in the saddle beside Daniel, her chin lifted high, daring anyone to question where she belonged. They went straight to the merchant's hall, where her father sat red-faced behind his desk, surrounded by ledgers and hired men who looked anywhere but at Daniel. The old man's pride was a fortress, but Daniel had faced worse storms. He stepped forward, rifle slung across his back, and said plain, your men came to take her. They failed. She's mine now, not because I stole her, but because she chose me. You can't buy or break that. His voice carried not as a threat, but as truth hammered into iron. The merchant tried to bluster, to thunder about shame, scandal, and the ruin of his good name. But Clara silenced him with a single sentence, your good name was never worth more than my happiness. Her words cut sharper than any blade. The room fell still. Even the clerks lowered their eyes. For the first time, the merchant looked small, his wealth and power shrunk before the unshakable resolve of his daughter and the mountain man's son. In the end, the old man had no choice but to bow his head. He dismissed his men, waved off the clerks, and muttered through clenched teeth, do as you will. But don't expect my blessing. Daniel's reply was calm, steady. I don't need it. He took Clara's hand, and together they walked out into the sunlight, where the townsfolk watched in awe. No preacher's blessing, no father's approval could weigh more than the bond they had forged in fire and defiance. By the time they reached the ridge again, Clara leaned against him, smiling through tears. We've started something bigger than us, she whispered. Daniel nodded, staring at the land that stretched wide and wild beneath the mountains. Then we'll see it through, he said. And with that vow, the valley turned a page, from scandal to legend, from whispers to respect. The story of the Dawson family was no longer a burden he carried, but a torch he bore, brighter than any shame the world had tried to lay on them. The weeks that followed were not easy. Though Clara stood proudly at Daniel's side, there were still whispers in town, sharp as thorns, meant to wound. Some said she had ruined herself, others claimed Daniel had bewitched her with wilderness ways. But neither flinched. They worked side by side on the land Daniel had claimed from the mountain slopes, building a cabin of rough-hewn logs and planting the first garden rows. Each nail hammered, each seed buried, was a declaration: we are building our own world, on our own terms. Slowly, the land answered them. A trickle of water Daniel had coaxed from the hillside fed their crops, and the soil gave back more than either had hoped. Neighbors who once mocked began to visit, curious first, then respectful. Clara's hands, once meant only for silks and ledgers, grew strong and steady with work. And at night, when the fire crackled low, she sang in a voice that carried through the valley, reminding Daniel that beauty could grow even in the hardest places. But not everyone was content to let them be. The merchant's pride had festered into anger, and he whispered to the railroad men who came sniffing around for land. He told them of Daniel's valley, of water that might feed their engines and pastures that could hold their herds. Greed took root, and soon word reached Daniel that surveyors were marking the ridges, their chains and stakes cutting across what he had fought to keep. Clara saw the storm gathering in her father's eyes, but she did not tremble. If he wants war, she told Daniel, then he'll find both of us waiting. The first clash came not with bullets, but with papers. Notices nailed to trees, declaring the land forfeit to the railroad, citing laws written in offices far from the mountains. Daniel tore them down with his bare hands, burning them in the hearth. Ink doesn't own land, he growled. Blood and sweat do. Clara stood beside him, her fingers tight around his arm. Together, they prepared, not just for the fight of their lives, but for the future of the family they dreamed of raising on that soil. On the ridge, with the wind in their hair and the valley spread wide below, Daniel swore an oath. They'll not take this from us. Not your father, not the railroad, not any man who thinks money is stronger than love. Clara kissed his hand, her eyes fierce with fire. Then we'll stand together, Daniel. And we'll win. And in that moment, the bond they had forged against shame became something greater, a force ready to face empires, as strong and untamed as the mountains themselves. The valley grew tense with strangers. Men in bowler hats and stiff coats came riding with clipboards and revolvers, measuring lines, driving stakes into earth that wasn't theirs. Daniel met them once, standing tall in the saddle, his Winchester across his lap. This land is Dawson land, he told them, calm but firm. Turn your mules around and take your stakes with you. They laughed at first, until they saw the steel in his eyes and the way his hand never strayed far from the rifle. They retreated that day, but it was clear, they would be back, and next time with force. Clara's father had joined their cause, feeding the railroad men promises and coin, telling anyone who would listen that Daniel was a squatter, a thief of soil that rightfully belonged to progress. But Clara was no longer the obedient daughter he remembered. She went into town, stood in front of the merchant hall where her father once sat, and declared before neighbors and strangers alike, this land was paid for with our blood and work. If progress means stealing a home, then I want no part of it. Some folks cheered her, others muttered, but no one could deny the fire in her voice. Nights grew restless. Daniel slept with his rifle near, and Clara kept lamps burning low, her ears sharp for hoofbeats. Once, under the cold shine of the moon, riders approached, railroad men testing their will. Shots cracked across the ridge, echoing like thunder. Daniel fired back, sharp and true, driving them into the dark. Clara stood at his side, reloading as quick as he could fire. When the smoke cleared, the valley was there still, but both knew the war was far from done. A week later, word spread that the railroad had petitioned the territorial court. Judges, bought with gold, were set to declare Daniel's land condemned, for the greater good. Clara's father smirked from the steps of the saloon, proud in his betrayal. Yet something else stirred in the town. Men and women who had once whispered began to speak louder, siding with Daniel and Clara. They had seen courage in the face of greed, love in the shadow of power. And courage, once seen, is hard to silence. Daniel and Clara knew they could not stand alone forever. They began gathering allies, ranchers tired of railroad claims, townsfolk weary of corruption, even drifters who respected a man who stood his ground. If they want a war, Daniel said one evening, his arm around Clara as the fire glowed low, then they'll find the valley ready. Clara pressed her head to his chest, her voice steady. And they'll learn love roots deeper than greed. Beyond the flames, the mountains loomed like silent guardians, waiting for the clash that would decide whether the Dawson name endured, or was buried.